All right. Um, so something that both teams could do a better job of in this debate is going for less arguments and more in depth. And so, like, I know you only have one off-case argument, but you're extending a bunch of pieces of evidence at the end and sort of, repeating the same point that the state is the cause of all the problems. And so on the flip side, you're going for, all the different types of evidence that you're reading, but you're going for, they've ceded the political and in the 2AR you mentioned nanotech, and then you have a bunch of other things that you're then going for. And instead of doing that, if you go to just one of them and explain the warrants more in depth, it's going to help both sides in the debate round. And so something that the 2AC needs to learn to do is that when you have to answer the first argument and then the second argument and the third argument, and so you have answers to things, but they're sort of there are also things that are not answered either. And so both the 2NC and the 1R need to sort of have that division of who's going to answer what arguments, and then make sure that you have answers to each one of them. And that becomes important when you start doing things like there's 3 different procedural arguments that exist in the 2AC, which are fiat abuse, the vagueness in terms of not specing the transition powers, and utopian fiat. And so you want to make sure that you have an answer to each one of those independent violations, because if they would collapse to just one, then you could lose on there, and your only answer is fiat allows us to do it, but they've presented theoretical reasons for why you should lose for having done it, and their argument is that it's unfair because you essentially fiat that everyone will walk away from the state, and then you just give fiat things like world peace and things like that. And so that's different than fiating individual government. And there's a lot of reasons why you could justify it, forcing it only about the states to not talk about individuals means that we are precluded a certain type of debate. There's also you're fiating not just a single actor. There's a bunch of people in Congress who you're going to have to fiat votes one way versus another way, and then you have to fiat that the courts will actually uphold it, and all these other methods of implementation. So their active fiat is a little bit more. But you need to have specific answers to that. But on the same side, if you're going to go for one of the procedural arguments, you really need to explain that all there, opposed to just sort of being well, we only get to fiat one agent and they can fiat everyone, and so that's just unfair is sort of the analysis at the end, and there's more in the 2AC. So that's one of the examples of where if you would just go for that argument and force yourself to talk about that one argument longer, you could beat the one answer that they have, which is just fiat, because now I'm it's just fiat and that's fine, and it's abusive because it's more than what we get to do. But why is more than what you get to do necessarily unfair? Right, and sort of getting those warrants, that's one of the examples of where that would that exists as well. And in a 1AR, if the block drops a bunch of the 2AC arguments, you should pick, again, one or two of them to go for that they don't answer at all. And so the one I like is nanotech, because it's even if, regardless of the state is good or bad, the state could regulate nanotech, and without nanotechnology everyone would go extinct, because we just have people making nanotechnology in their basements, and then they could but you don't do it in the 1AR. In the 2AR you can't do it because he didn't do it. And even if you did, you were just and then there's this nanotech that causes extinction, right? And so that's part of the examples that I'm talking about, where it's just if you do more analysis, it's going to make all judges happier with you, and then it's not which do I like more and stuff. Yeah?
So just my saying they haven't addressed it, therefore we should win on this alone?
Not enough. You're right, they didn't address it, but because if you said the sky was made of rainbows, and they didn't address that, and you're well, they didn't address that, that doesn't mean you win. Now you have to explain to me why that argument wins you the round, which requires explaining the reasons within that argument, right? So it's it's conceded, but now what should I do with that as a judge? And so it's here's extinction, and it's and then they're but here's dehumanization, and so both teams are sort of going back on that point. So if you do explanation on one scenario, it's going to make the judge be a lot more comfortable voting on that one argument versus just here's 10 different reasons, all that have 5 seconds of explanation. Just in an academic paper in a debate round, you want to have a couple of really well-reasoned arguments then versus a bunch of one sentence things without warrants. And so that's sort of what both sides could do a better job doing. Because you're also right at points that when you say the state is the cause of all the problems, you just it's a matter of fact. And so you have to assume and for both teams, you always want to assume that the judge disagrees with you, and then convince them that you're right. Because if you convince the judge that you're right, then you win the round. If you just assume that the judge is on the same page as you, then it's more likely for any judge to sort of like, well, flip a coin in my mind and I'll decide this way versus that way. And so you need to make sure that you sort of do that work for them and essentially write the ballot for them at the end of the round. So in the end, I vote affirmative in this round, and it's because I think that what the negative really needs is an explanation of how a world without a state would be able to function. And so, like, they point to their evidence, and they explain that, like, without a state, people will still have conflict and, fight, and then, there'll be diseases, and the government's needed. So you need to explain how would civil disobedience, which is, like, posited against a state, after that state goes away, what then happens to solve those problems? Like, how would we get together and do that? And there's a bunch of evidence that you do read originally in when you're reading cards that make these arguments, but that's the part that's not explaining. That's the most important to explain, because that's what they're doing the best at explaining on the affirmative side. They're the best at explaining why we need the state to do a couple of things. So now you need to explain why we don't need to do the state to do these things. And so, like, people get together to solve diseases. There's a bunch of cures that have come up not by patents and not by government regulations, but because someone cared about doing something. And so when they cared about doing something, they were more inspired to do research versus trying to get a paycheck and trying to work for the state or get in a government lab. And so that could be an example of where maybe even government regulations prevent innovative science technology that could have solved diseases or could solve global warming. And so giving examples like that could then be like, world without a state is good, and then when you fill in the other part of like how the state actually causes these problems, like regulations that prevent innovation consistently can be an example that stops disease cure or whatever. And so then you have examples that are specific to their affirmative and everything else, right? Global warming is not being solved because the government has legislation that allows people to pollute, and just, regulating some of them doesn't be able to solve. So those sort of specifics, and like you point to like how government's refusal to sign the Kyoto Protocol, and then even if they did, the protocol is wildly inadequate to even be able to stop that, and then now you have a scenario to their leadership scenario and stuff like that. And you don't necessarily need evidence for each one, but if you can make that analytical explanation within your cards, then it's like, aha, I can see it. Otherwise, I'm not necessarily sure why it specifically turns their thing versus not. And something that the affirmative could do is like remind, you just sort of assert like the solvency of your affirmative, and it's like, yeah, they do drop it, the specific, like shifting it and doing those 4 things will be able to solve, but you don't explain that all over again. Right, and so that's again one of the situations where it's like, sure, you get it, but to get speaker points up and to really win why this government action is a good government action, it's easier if you do that specific solvency explanation, opposed to what you do is you default back to sort of your generic evidence in the 2AC that just says we need the state to solve things, and you do a good job on that portion of it, but you then forget, like, if you do that portion with our specific plan is a good state action, then that becomes now a full, complete story specific to your affirmative, opposed to just being like this turning into state good, state bad debate. You could have both sides could do more to make that actually clash state good, state bad. In this particular instance is why we have to eliminate the state, or why we need to keep just this affirmative plan intact. And so those are sort of the ways that you sort of bring the debate to the next level on both sides. Does anybody have any questions?
But the analytical argument, is that like not needed, or is it still good to keep it in there?
Which analytical argument, or just analytical arguments in general?
The one when we had knowledge in the beginning of the tag. Ontology, I don't know why I said
Okay. Ontology. Ontology must come first. Okay, so ontology is the study of being, which is sort of what is and what exists. And so it's relevant to your criticism because they believe that all that can exist is the state, that there's no other regulation. So it's a study of being and what sort of exists here. And so, sometimes when people talk about ontology in relation to blackness, it's a question of like the black body being invisible, not being seen as even a thing that exists there. So it's an ontological question. And so you're questioning the formation of how we come to know and understand the state. So in that sense, it's relevant. And the reason why why your authors say that ontology should come first is because we can't figure out something like if the state is good or bad until we can figure out the question about what can exist outside of the state and how we come to know that state. So in order to debate the questions about can the state be effective, we first have to figure out how we come to know what the state is, in a sense. And so that's why sort of That's why the evidence is within the critique, because the point is, because then it means that it doesn't matter if they solve nuclear war or anything like that, because you're saying before we question things like exist, we can't go extinct if we don't know what exists to go extinct. So we have to have the question of existence before the question of extinction. So it's sort of a way to preempt those impacts. Is sort of how it's deployed in regards to the criticism. Yeah, and then it's just sort of like extinction comes first. Extinction comes first. Like, why does extinction come first? And then, like, just to win against people that are doing dehumanization type stuff, like, have a reason for why. I mean, it's gonna sound silly, but why life is good. Like, why ought we exist is important, because once you start questioning why ought we exist, then you're sort of doing an ontological questioning, because you're questioning what's good about what is, opposed to just assuming what is good, and therefore it shouldn't die. But if you can't show that what exists is good, then why bother preserving it? So there's sort of a prerequisite question that you don't get at is why it's good. You just sort of say, we need to preserve it. And obviously, presumptions on your side, things existing, people generally don't want to go extinct. But if it's a question of ontology and stuff like that, then sometimes that might not matter as much. Yeah. All right, good debate.